Hi, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us through the scheduling changes. So I'm pleased to introduce our next panelist, Carla Mantilla, who will be speaking about the LGBT movement and transgender ideology. Carla Mantilla is a board member of WDI USA. She was managing editor of Feminist Studies from 2005 to 2023, and a longtime collective member of Off Our Backs News Journal from 1993 to 2008. She's the author of Gender Trolling, How Misogyny Went Viral, published by Prager in 2015, and she taught sociology and statistics at George Mason University, Gettysburg College, McDaniel College, and the University of Maryland at College Park. Join me in welcoming Carla Mantilla.
Hello, I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to try to talk today about one of the things I'm interested in is how did we get here? How did the transgender movement gain a foothold so quickly? First slide. Sure, first hold. Thank you. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so how did the transgender, and I want to apologize, the slides are a little bit off because they imported from PowerPoint to Google Slides, so I'm sure everyone cares about that. But anyway, so transgender ideology has pervaded our society so quickly, and it hasn't been that long. I mean, the educational sector, throughout all these institutions, nonprofits, it's just endemic. So I think that there's, and actually I'm interested in exploring more, but I'm highlighting several factors that paved the way, although today the talk is only going to be about the last factor, which is the gay rights movement. So I'll just give a brief overview of a couple others that I think are also important. One of them is, the first one is academia, and I think we're all familiar with that, where postmodernism, which kind of was a philosophical theory that emerged in the 1960s, late 60s, and became predominant in the 1970s throughout academia, that morphed into queer theory, which has then converted women's studies into gender studies and LGBT studies. I talked about this in much more detail at the last conference. I spent 18 years working at an academic women's studies journal where I saw firsthand the way this kind of theorizing and ideology had permeated and pervaded the academic texts, both in women's studies and throughout the humanities in academia. There's a lot to postmodernist theory, but one of the important factors, I think, is the idea that there's no such thing in this theory as reality or truth. So both of those are considered to be subjective, and the fact that they're subjective, of course, you can see how that would lead to or pave the way to men believing they're women and people believing they have identities that do not comport with objective biological facts. A second area that I think has contributed to the spread of transgender ideology is psychological theory and psychological therapy. Now, I'm not opposed to psychological therapy or anything like that, but I think there have been some strands, some ideological strands that have run through that area that have paved the way also for transgenderism. One of them is this idea, and talked about throughout a lot of therapeutic practices, is the idea there's something as my truth and your truth, but not the truth. Obviously, that's kind of derives from postmodernist theory, but it's a lot of people, talk about that in the therapeutic setting. Additionally, obviously in therapy, there's a primacy of feelings, which can be very subjective. And of course, feelings are important, emotions are important. I'm certainly not arguing that they're not. But it's important to look at emotions not devoid from the social context that gave rise to them and from the specific cultural patterns that would affect them. Amy Souza talked about that in her recent talk. I thought she really made a lot of good points about that. The last one and there's a lot more to this in the psychological theories, but another common one is this idea that, validity being valid. And of course, we all know that non-binary is valid, right? Interestingly, valid, one of the dictionary definitions is that it means based on logic and facts, which is ironic. I'll leave it at that. A third ideological trend in society or facet is capitalism and the technological advances that relate from capitalism. And those also, as Amy Souza talked beautifully about in her talk, lead to the commodification of people and to the external consumerist solutions to social maladies. So, for example, people are encouraged to alter their bodies in response to human dissatisfactions. Plastic surgeries, including liposuction, Botox, breast augmentation, and labiaplasty. Labiaplasty, of course, has come about, most feminists believe, due to the advent of pornography and the way women's genitals are portrayed through pornography. Pornography and prostitution are also examples of a consumerist commodification of, in particular, women's bodies for the most part. And we have seen how pornography and its incredible increase, largely due to technology, and men, has resulted in a pathway toward transgenderism, particularly through sissy porn, which is a kind of porn that where men try to pretend to be subordinate, to be women in the ways of they dress in the way they view women dress, makeup, and sexual submissiveness is part and parcel of sissy porn. And there a lot of men come to believe that they're, quote, women after viewing copious amounts of sissy porn. But the last factor that I'm going to be talking about today, which I'm going to talk about at length, is the lesbian and gay movement. I believe that the lesbian and gay movement was at a certain point co-opted by gay men and became subject to what I would call gay male ideology. And how this happened is that there was a decline in feminism, and I believe that was due to backlash. Just to kind of explain that often after a very powerful moment of feminist activism, it's followed by backlash. So in the first wave of feminism, which kind of culminated in the United States and in many countries in the early 20th century, 1900s, with the women's vote, there were tremendous achievements that were managed due to that movement. There were economic reforms, and women had a few more economic opportunities. Married women were allowed to finally control their own property to some extent, and of course the vote, full enfranchisement for most women. Right after that, however, there became a period of regression, and during the 1940s and 50s, throughout much of the Western world, the prototype for women, or the way to be a woman, became focused on being wives and mothers. And working outside the home was not generally, depending on whether there was a need because of various wars, but mostly women were supposed to be at home in the family. And that was a period of backlash after the very prolific first wave. The second wave, of course, happened around the 1960s and 70s. This is presuming a wave model, which there's some criticism of, but we'll go with it for now. So the second wave, of course, was characterized by tremendous gains, including awareness of rape. Rape crisis centers were developed all over the country, all over the various countries, as a matter of fact. The concept of marital rape and date rape were just those had not even been talked about before, but there's consciousness raised around those. Domestic violence as well, tremendous consciousness raising around that. Domestic violence shelters, laws changed. All this was tremendous work by so many women during that time. Awareness of stalking came out of that time period. And of course, abortion rights, which we now see are being rolled back. However, after that second wave, I believe there has been a backlash again. And it's debatable as to when or exactly what forms it takes. But I think certainly by the late 90s to the early 2000s, and especially of late, I think the transgender movement has been embodied a lot of that backlash. And I would also argue that the advent of pornography has been a big part of that backlash. So because of the backlash, now in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of lesbians, because they tended to be identified as lesbians and feminists because of the prolific times of the feminist movement, the gay rights movement had a feminist influence to some extent. And lesbians were not just going to go along with whatever gay men said. But as there became a decline in feminist ideology, feminist consciousness, the gay rights movement had an ascendancy, and lesbian activism turned, in general, away from feminism and toward gay activism. So a lot of lesbians today identify more with being gay and being part of the LGBT movement than with being feminists. It's important to remember that the gay men are still men, and they are male-identified to some extent, although this is sometimes more covert than we recognize. But gay male ideology pervades the gay rights movement, and I believe that inevitably has paved the way and led to transgender ideology. Next slide. So today I'm just going to talk about three ideas that have pervaded the gay rights movement. These are not overtly articulated by the gay rights, mainstream gay rights organizations like GLAAD or HRC, but I believe they are premises that are embedded within that movement. The first one is that gender nonconformity has nothing at all to do with being gay. That it's only about same-sex attraction. There's nothing else going on. And that has to do, to some extent, and I'll argue more about this soon, that wanting to assimilate. Gay men want to assimilate in mainstream culture. The second one that I'll be talking about today is gay liberation has become synonymous with sexual libertarianism, which is obviously a male sex right movement. And the last one, which is maybe not everyone will agree with, but I think it's an interesting proposition, is the idea of the kind of placing inclusion as a paramount goal of the gay rights movement. Next slide. So the first one, gender nonconformity is irrelevant to being gay, nothing to see here. Just for the record, for when I'm talking today about gender, my use of the word gender means the enactment of stereotypical sex roles. I don't mean biology, I don't mean sex, or biological sex. So again, the idea is that gay people are just the same as heterosexuals, but just they have a different sexual orientation and there's nothing else. Being gay is portrayed throughout mainstream gay rights as not related to gender nonconformity. Gay people can be any which way, except we know it is. Not 100%, and I'm not saying it's 100%, but we know there's a correlation. It's obvious, it's empirically obvious. One of the things is, what's gaydar about? Gaydar is often about, it's often about seeing somebody who's not gender conforming. And we're like, oh, that, a man who maybe is a little bit effeminate in some ways, a lesbian who wears sensible shoes and has short hair. That's what gaydar is. Not 100%, but that's a big factor of it. On some level, we know. And until recently, children who were gender nonconforming, a little boy who liked to play with dolls and wanted to have long hair and wear dresses, people would say, well, he may grow up to be gay. Not 100%, but the odds were certainly there. So there's a correlation between gender nonconformity and being gay. And one thing I want to say, too, is that all gender nonconformity should not only be thought of as the way you dress or your outward appearance. There are many aspects of gender nonconformity that, for example, a woman being particularly outspoken or being assertive or being in a leadership role or not wanting to do traditional women's work, those are also expressions of gender nonconformity. So it's important to bear that in mind. So what's important about gender nonconformity is that it's a form of resistance to stereotypical and heteronormative gender roles. And when we pretend that gender nonconformity has nothing to do with being gay, we're separating out this resistance to gender roles from being gay. And it's an important thing to know that, because this resistance to these normative gender roles is foundational to feminism. It's foundational to the liberation of women from gendered stereotypes. It's not all that feminism's about, but it's certainly a very important aspect. But because gender nonconformity among gay people is not acknowledged, the potential feminist consciousness that could arise from gay identity is suppressed. So there is a kind of a, I believe there's a kind of a move toward resisting gender roles, which is often part and parcel of being gay, both gay men and lesbians. But because that gender nonconformity is kind of not talked about, I kind of see it as the crazy ant in the attic of the gay rights movement. She's up there, everyone can hear her, but we're gonna pretend she's not. Because we're not admitting that, there's no way to kind of see the feminist potential that could arise from a whole swath of people in society who are resisting the heteronormative gender roles. And at the same time, gender nonconformity has been increasing in our society, but there's no feminist lens to look at it with. And of course, transgender ideology has filled up that void. The next thing I want to say, we're good, is that this is a little bit controversial also, and most people don't agree with me on this, but you're welcome not to. I believe that there's a connection between being gay, and gender nonconformity challenges the born this way narrative. The idea that being gay only arises from being born that way. And that, of course, is something that gay men want to say, because they want to say that we're just the same, it's just this tiny little detail that's different, and we want to assimilate. But hear me out on this. If being gender nonconforming is correlated with or connected to being gay, then it doesn't make sense that being gay is purely due to biologically causes or to being innate, unless we think that genes would code for culturally specific gender stereotypes. Like, is it genetic that a little boy likes to play with Barbies or a little girl likes to play baseball? It just doesn't, to me, it doesn't add up that gendered stereotypes would be related to your genetic, something in your DNA or some genetic predisposition. I could be wrong, but this is just the way I see it. To me, it defies credulity to think that a propensity for culturally produced norms for restricting gender roles is due to a genetic predisposition. The other thing is that seeing being gay and also gender nonconformity as innate, as you're born this way, it means there's no political or feminist analysis as to why women or men would reject normative gender roles. So you can't think about these gender roles in a political or feminist way. Additionally, something that I think is not commonly known these days is that in the 1980s, there was a tremendous debate about the born this way narrative, with many more gay men being on the side of feeling that they were born this way, and many more lesbians, and not all lesbians for sure, but many more lesbians saying that they felt that their sexual orientation or our sexual orientation was not that we were not born this way, and that it was, in addition to a sexual orientation, it was also an affectional orientation, an affectional preference for women, and it reflects centering women and not men in our lives. Additionally, for many lesbians, being a lesbian is about rejecting the patriarchal gender roles designated for women. So both of those are political, and I don't see how they could be biological. The next thing is that not all gender nonconformity is about liberation, and some expressions of it are about reenacting regressive sexist gender stereotypes. So because there's no political analysis, because being gay is born this way, there's no way we can evaluate which aspects of gender nonconformity are liberatory, which are leading to the liberation of women, and which ones are regressive. So some gender nonconformity is about taking, for women, maybe taking power back from men. Again, being assertive, being confident, resisting being subordinate. Those are great forms of gender nonconformity. But recently, there's been a much greater celebration of forms of what I call hyperfemininity and hypermasculinity in dress and appearance. And I don't think that those are tending toward the liberation of women. Many of those celebrate the negative aspects of femininity, like for men who pretend to be women, they're often all about trying to be a sex object, being helpless, being subordinate. There are some people that celebrate negative aspects of masculinity, being tough, unfeeling, aggressive, or objectifying others. So because we have tied being gay with being, and then they're gender nonconforming, we pretend that's not there, and then we say it's all biological, we're unable to parse out which parts of being gay and being gender nonconforming are toward the liberation of women and which parts are regressive and are reenacting gendered stereotypes in a way that's not feminist. Okay, next slide. So the second aspect of the gay male ideology that I'm going to talk about is that gay liberation has become synonymous with sexual libertarianism. And sexual libertarianism is basically the freedom to sexually exploit others without consequences. There has become to be an acceptance and even celebration of all kinds of sexual proclivities. Sexual libertarianism enshrines the right to sexual pleasure without concern for the well-being of others. It allows for the use of others' bodies for sex, and it celebrates transactional sex. It also celebrates objectification of others for one's own sexual use, and it celebrates promiscuous and anonymous sex. Both the latter of which have been predominant through especially the early gay male rights movement, especially pre-AIDS. Again, gay men are men, and they hold attitudes of male domination. I believe that may be one of the reasons why gay rights has achieved mainstream acceptance so quickly, as opposed to other liberation movements that are fighting more entrenched power structures, like racism and sexism. The gay rights movement, I don't believe, has threatened male power and male sexual power in a significant way. So sexual libertarianism results in breaking down sexual taboos should be seen as a fundamental part of the gay liberation movement. I believe that's why the gay men have fallen prey to infiltration of pedophiles in their movement. In the 1970s, National Man-Boy Love Association, NAMBLA, was tried to be kind of ride on the coattails of the gay movement. And these days, it's MAP, or minor attracted people, who are also can kind of perceive that sexual libertarianism is a part and parcel of the gay movement, so they see a home for them in that place. Not obviously, many gay people don't go along with that, but the fact that they are kind of trying to make inroads into that particular movement, I think, has to do with this embedded ideology of sexual libertarianism. Sexual libertarianism also results in seeing paraphilias being embraced as part of diversity that we should embrace. It's noteworthy that paraphilias are almost exclusively engaged in by men. Sexual libertarianism results in the open displays of nudity, kink, BDSM gear, furries, etc. at pride parades, and being sexually open and outrageous in public. And people think of that's what part of being gay is. Being gay is, they go to gay, so many straight people go to gay pride parades and they see these displays of just, very male, to my view, well, certainly objectifying, if not predatory behavior. And they think, great. I remember being in a pride parade and a woman saw all this stuff. A straight woman was there and she just saw all this stuff. She says, so much in diversity. And I thought, well, yeah, but is it good? So lastly, the Born This Way narrative that embraces about sexuality, that the gay rights movement embraces, does not account for the harms of paraphilias, of sexual exploitation, and sexual objectification. If being gay is inborn, then our paraphilias also as inborn sexual expression. Again, seeing it as inborn doesn't allow us to critique the paraphilias. Is this true for pedophilia? Of course, and some pedophiles argue that it is. It's just their unique, diverse sexual expression. The Born This Way narrative allows no philosophical grounds to see the harms of sexual exploitation, such as pornography or prostitution. And it allows no grounds to see the way that male sexuality can be, and often is, founded on a misogynistic worldview, because it holds sexuality as off limits to political analysis. There's no basis with which to evaluate the oppressive or liberatory effects of the increasingly wide array of gender and sexual orientation or identities. I believe that sexuality, sexual proclivities, and even sexual orientation, rather than being purely innate, are influenced by psychological, social, and cultural factors. Sexuality can be imbued with dominant and subordinate paradigms and with male domination and male supremacy. Finally, sexuality as a primary site of women's oppression should not be off limits to feminist analysis. Next slide. The last aspect of gay male ideology that I believe is embedded in the gay rights movement is the idea that inclusion and non-discrimination are paramount and bottom line goals. Now, of course, inclusion has its place. I'm not saying inclusion is never okay, but I want to place it into context. Because gay men have been excluded from the privileges of straight men, inclusion is high on their list of priorities because they feel like they're kind of one step away from being in the top tier, in the top rank. And I'm talking, I guess, mostly about white gay men, of which there are quite a few. They want in to the one arena that they have been left out of, straight male privilege. Gay men are loyal to male interests. So and I believe that the hypervaluation of inclusion is, additionally, as a result of a misapplied model of oppression. So I'm going to talk about oppression in terms of Marilyn Frye's model of oppression based on her book, The Politics of Reality. It's a really important book. If you haven't read it, I really advocate checking it out. It was groundbreaking and very influential at its time, and I believe it still is. And her model of oppression is that you have to think of oppression like the bars of a bird cage. So each kind of factor is a different bar. And of course, if you only have 2 or 3 bars, the birds can fly around it. And so where's the oppression? I mean, you could have a few obstacles, but it's not oppression. But as you add more and more bars to the cage, then the bird becomes trapped. So different oppressions work differently and have different bars. The bars are made up of different things. Well, in the United States in particular, racism obviously is a huge factor in our culture, in our national conversation. It's been at the forefront for hundreds of years. And I believe that there's been a misappropriation and simplistic understanding of racism in the United States, and it has been seen that the primary way that racism has been enacted in this country is through discrimination. Now, discrimination has been important, and it's definitely one of the bars of the cage. But what I think the reason why a lot of Americans like that idea that discrimination is the main thing we're talking about when we talk about racism is because it allows people to think, well, we solved that with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which barred discrimination in public accommodations. So we're good. But that's only one bar. There's a lot of different bars that form the network that forms racial oppression. So for example, environmental racism, the way the legal system is disproportionately enacted so that it leads to the way the incarceration rates in this country. There's a systemic unequal access to resources, including housing and the way mortgages have been handled, food and food deserts, the education system, jobs, unequal health care. It goes on, and I haven't begun to mention all of the things, but there are a lot of bars to the cage of racial oppression. So similarly, there are a lot of bars to the cage of women's oppression. And because so many Americans want to think that discrimination is the defining paradigm of oppression, they move that to all other oppressions. And so there's this idea that inclusion will solve all oppressions. I think this is, inclusion is important at times and in places, but even in the movement against racial injustice, many, many black groups have felt that separatism has been an important aspect of their liberation, from communities, some of which were, Greenwood, which was unfortunately massacred in Oklahoma, but a lot of communities really did well by being separatist to some extent. Marcus Garvey was a long proponent of that, and certainly Louis Farrakhan, and there have been different groups, and the Black Panther movement. So separatism has been seen as an important facet of black liberation as well. And I think it's an important part of women's liberation as well, especially because women, in addition to being harmed from discrimination, which we have been, but violence and sexual violation are also very fundamental and important aspects of women's oppression. Sexuality is a key arena, or one of the bars of the cage, of women's oppression. So sexual violence, sexual objectification, control of women's reproductive capacity, and sexual coercion are all, in addition to many other aspects, again, healthcare, abortion, access. So while inclusion is good at times and certainly important, I think making it the paradigmatic or the most important, the paramount value in the gay liberation movement, it ignores the unique ways that women's oppression functions, and oppression, inclusion does not serve us at all times. Last slide. Okay, how does gay male ideology then lead to transgenderism? So I've critiqued all these ideas of gay male ideology. Well, because the gay male movement disavows gender nonconformity, being gender nonconforming is now seen as being transgender. I believe that transgender or non-binary have basically become code words for gender nonconformity. That's how we think about it now. If a kid or an adult is gender nonconforming, well, they must be transgender. It can't be that they are objecting to the way gender roles are structured to account for domination of men and subordination of women. That can't be it. It must mean they're transgender. Gay rights has left a giant vacuum by ignoring gender nonconformity that has been filled by transgenderism. The gender nonconformity is now channeled into regressive enactments of sex-based stereotypes because there's no political analysis of it. Secondly, if gay people are born this way, the assumption is that transgender people are as well. So lesbians and gay men who object to transgenderism are seen as hypocritical. How dare we? And I've had people ask me this very question: how dare you object to transgender people if you want inclusion as a lesbian? Well, there's all the precepts are wrong on that, because I don't believe that we're born this way. So I believe we want to include certain things and other things we don't want to include based on whether they further or not women's liberation. Sexual libertarianism precludes an analysis of sexuality in terms of dominance and subordination, and it precludes a way of conceptualizing sexual harm. It leads to minimizing and ignoring the dangers to women of male predators who are pretending to be women in order to gain access to women's spaces. So because we can't look at sexuality and what it means and dominance and subordination, we are rendered, the male predators are rendered invisible to us because it's all diversity. Sexual libertarianism means paraphilias, including autogynephilia, are celebrated as part of sexual diversity. And finally, inclusion, as a fundamental principle of the gay rights movement, will logically extend to being inclusive of people who say they're transgender. So if inclusion is the most important value to undermining oppression, how dare we not include transgender people? And as also, inclusion as a fundamental principle ends up overriding women's safety and denies biological realities. For example, in sports, pregnancy and motherhood, and other physical differences and vulnerabilities. So we end up with lesbian consciousness is often more allied with gay male interests than with women's interests. We end up with lesbians supporting sexual libertarianism as part of being gay and the gay and lesbian movement, and inclusions of sexual diversity without a feminist analysis. We end up with lesbians supporting paraphilias and including autogynephilia, seen as sexual diversity, again, without a feminist consciousness as to what those practices mean for women. Lesbians celebrate prostitution and pornography as sexual freedom issues, rather than women's rights, seeing them as women's right to be free from sexual assault, sexual objectification, and degradation, which are inherent in prostitution and pornography. We have lesbians who attend drag queen shows, and they think that at gay pride, what you do is you all go to see a drag queen show, as though, you know, gay men doing their drag queen thing is synonymous with gay liberation. I've heard of lesbians going to strip bars without any consciousness of what they mean for women. We have lesbians cheerleading the transactional male view of sexuality, rather than a sexuality based on connection, intimacy, dignity, and the respect of self and others. We have lesbians who believe in transgenderism and gender identity as concepts. And finally, we have lesbians who think they are men because they're gender nonconforming. Yeah, oh yeah, questions, sure. I was ready to leave.
You can't leave quite yet.
What, 10 minutes? Okay.
Is this
Yes.
working? You can all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm wondering, what do we do with all this information, basically? Like, I think you've laid out an amazing view of the history, how we got here, how gay male ideology has contributed to where we are now in a number of ways. So how do we go out there after this convention and act on that?
Well, specifically, I don't know. I mean, the one thing I can think of is I think it's really important for lesbians to not see ourselves as part and parcel of the gay male movement and of the LGBT movement, for there to be at least a wedge and an idea. I kind of often think about how you can look at things through a feminist lens or through a gay lens or a gay trans lens. And I've given the example of, for example, when we talk about men who think they're women, and they often become that, you know, part of that movement is because they want to feel like a sex object. They want to be objectified in their idea of what the male gaze is. They want to perform and take on these aspects of hyperfemininity. So it's about moving towards sexual objectification. Whereas many times lesbians who want to be men are actually moving away from sexual objectification. They're not wanting to be seen through the male gaze and a target of that kind of predatory male behavior. So if you look at those through a gay LGBT lens, you see transgender people. If you look at those through a feminist lens, you see completely differently motivated activities. So I think part of it is just we need to somehow raise awareness among lesbians and other women too. You're all included. That part of inclusion I'm for. That being allied with gay people is not the same as gay male ideology. No, please go ahead. Kara would like to say something.
This is so awful. This is Carla's panel. What am I doing? So, Catherine, thank you for the question. One takeaway. First of all, thank you, Carla. That was fascinating. One takeaway that from her talk that to me was like a light bulb, and it's annoying to me that it's so obvious that I didn't get it before, is an answer to the question, why do so many women support this when it is so antithetical to women's rights? And so the answers are usually something like, oh, internalized misogyny, internalized lesbophobia, patriarchy, blah, 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 blah. And there's never been such a coherent, crisp, clear answer that I've heard than they lack a feminist analysis. That's just it. Thanks.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi there. I really agree with all the things you say, but I think there's a piece missing. And for anybody who was at the panel that Amy just gave, I think one of the key pieces, as Amy pointed out, is marketing. The way I see it is that the movement for LGBT rights was Trojan horsed by T money
Yes.
and a T agenda, and I could say reasons, but I don't have time to do that. But so they were, and then it kind of piggybacked on the LGBT movement and kind of hijacked all the NGOs and organizations that had been set up by and for gay people, for gay rights and protections, and it dovetailed perfectly with a gay male sexual libertarianism agenda. But if it weren't for the all these, I think, transvestic fetishists, a lot of straight men, very rich, and corporations who saw profit after AIDS of like, here's a very wealthy demographic, how can we monetize them further? And it created foot soldiers for bad ideas. And so I think the foot soldiers have been marketed this idea of LGBT, I just want to say LGB, drop the T, but sold this idea, and people have kind of grown up with it. And that if you ask why lesbians and gay men, younger people, older, I don't know, but they've been sold this idea of forced teaming, and that if it weren't for the T, the gays wouldn't have the rights. And I hear it all the time. We have to thank the poor black trans women for our rights. So it's marketing. I see it as a marketing issue. That money pours in to these organizations to promote these bad ideas and create these foot soldiers. How could almost anybody escape it? The few of us who've escaped it are very unusual, rare people. So that's why, no, I really, but and maybe we have some feminism in our head, like Cara says, but I think you have to not say, I don't know why this happened, I don't know how the gay men got off track. They were kind of persuaded and forced off track by a major amount of money. So I'm gonna let you talk.
I just want to say I totally agree with you, and I wish I'd listened to Amy Souza's talk before I wrote this one, because she said a lot of great stuff. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hi. I think this was a great talk. One of the things that I've thought about as I was listening to you are people like Gail Rubin, who was actually in my first women's group in Ann Arbor, who went on to influence Judith Butler, and they're very much into S&M and that kind of, and they're very big rock stars in academia.
Yes.
And I think that, we don't think of it as a gay male led, because it's like, oh, it's Judith Butler, so I just wanted you to comment on that.
I think there's always been women who have been basically co-opted by male interests and have been apologists for, it's basically the right's answer to Phyllis Schlafly.
Interesting, yeah, absolutely.
Or the left's answer to Phyllis Schlafly, sorry. That's what I'm sorry. Oh, yes.
Hi. Loved your talk. I thought it was really thought-provoking. I just had some questions that are probably going to be ill-formed about your comments on Born This Way, which you seem to sort of set up as a bugaboo or whatever. But you mentioned Born This Way doesn't account for paraphilias or sexual exploitation. Why should it? I was born this way. I think I'm one of these people who think she really was born lesbian, just as there are straight people who, I think a lot of straight people think they were born straight. They may not articulate it, but they've always been attracted to the opposite sex, just like I've always been attracted to the same sex. And so I don't feel like there was a line about if gay people or born this way, the assumption is that trans people must be as well. I don't necessarily agree with that. If X, then Y. I don't quite understand that. And maybe it's because I am coming at it from a, I mean, I've never seen born this way as any way to justify, however you, okay, let's say, for example, maybe somebody was born to molest children. That doesn't make it okay.
Right.
And,
I
you
mean,
know,
yeah, I think it's very legitimate. You know, I'm very much in the minority for thinking the way I do, and people feel very differently than me, and it's certainly a point of very good, you know, I honor your beliefs is what I'm
but are
trying
you
to say.
saying you don't think people are?
I don't, and one of the reasons why I don't is, I'll just say another thing, which is that people often say the reason that they know they're born that way is they felt that way from a very early age. And I think we or underestimate the amount of way all kinds of factors affect us from a very early age. And I give the example of, to the extent that English was your first language, for the people here for whom it was, or whatever your first language is, we spoke that language from a very early age. We think in that language. We even dream in that language. English is, or if it is your first or your native language, is very deeply embedded in our brain. It doesn't mean we were anything genetic coded for that. I just think that, and people think that it's something like, well, no one would teach you to be gay, but I think that often being gay, again, in my way of looking at things, has a lot to do with maybe an inborn rebellion. Maybe it isn't inborn, I mean, that's the wrong word, but it's a kind of a early rebellion, seeing the way gender roles play out and just feeling like, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to live like that. I don't want to be in that situation. And being gay is one avenue out of the heteronormative patriarchal gender roles. And I think you can kind of have a gut sense of that, even as a child.
Yeah, but I'm not even, let's not even talk about,
Sure.
I'm not even talking about rebelling or whatever. I'm just talking about plain old strong attraction to the same sex. And,
Right.
and there are people who have that strong attraction, and they might be totally conforming to
That's
what
true.
we call female gender roles. There are people in this room
Yeah.
who do that. And so I don't know, I've always tried to separate. I understand that, that being gay or being lesbian is almost, I guess, unavoidably tied up in a political thing, and I understand why. But it's also in and of itself its own thing, just as heterosexuality is. And I'm not saying that everyone is. And when I say born this way, I mean, yeah, it can be maybe a mixture of genetic or environmental factors or whatever it is. I'm just saying that from a very young age, before there's any awareness of roles and women's place in the world, some people really do have the strong attraction to the same sex. That's
I mean, I see it differently, but I think you have a very legitimate criticism. I will say that. I can totally see that point of view. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, I'm a little bit short, but so first of all, I wanted to say that I agree with you and about how oftentimes sexual orientation is based on gender roles, gender stereotypes, and preferences. But a lot of my friends online consider me bisexual for saying that.
Yes.
And even though, it depends who you ask what my sexual orientation is, because I've only ever dated women and I would only ever date women. So, according to your philosophy, I would be a lesbian. And I agree. But I can't call myself a lesbian to my friends because they think that I'm appropriating lesbianism, because they say that, well, if you think it's based on gender roles, then that's because you're attracted to men too. Right. But that's the thing. So my question for you is, there's a lot of my friends who are online and they're young, and they say that they're lesbians. Do you believe that every lesbian is born, every lesbian is a political lesbian, that she chooses it, or do you believe some are actually really born this way? And if they are, how can you tell the difference?
I don't know if it matters to tell the difference because it's just, I mean, God, I mean, I don't know if I believe that, I don't know if I'm right about this because there's no data. It's just theory, you know, and I could be wrong. It could, you know, maybe tomorrow somebody will come out with the genetic, you know, remember the fingers are different lengths and that tells whether you're a lesbian. I don't know. But I do believe that people make choices and can be attracted to, for example, I mean, I've talked about this with my partner who believes she was born that way, okay? And she tells me, like, well, I was just early on attracted to women. And I'm like, well, that, like, from the time of, like, 4. And I'm like, well, that couldn't have been a sexual attraction because that's not what it's about. So it's an affectional, and I think if it's an affectional attraction, I think we're attracted to things that feel good to us, that feel like they're going to be positive, that feel like they're going to be wonderful or caring or loving. And if we associate that with women, then we're attracted to women. But I, you know, and I was straight and now I'm a lesbian. I've now been a lesbian longer, I've been straight, and I don't think I was born that way, and I'm totally cool with being a lesbian. I'm very happy. And I don't call myself bisexual. So I don't have an answer, though.
Thanks, Carla. That was great. Our next sessions will be in salons G and H, so not in